Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. I recently realized that it's been a while since we've seen Kyle Butt on this channel, so I decided to go see what he's been up to recently. And what do you know, back in March he uploaded a video about 6 facts that prove Jesus rose from the dead. I doubt this list is going to be anything different than the normal apologetic thing. Empty tomb, a couple of ancient historians mention that Christians exist, disciples wouldn't die for a lie, etc. But coming from Mr. Butt, it might be a bit more entertaining. So let's go!
Jesus Christ claimed to be God in the flesh.
More accurately stated, it was written that he claimed to be God in the flesh several decades after his death.
And one of the pieces of evidence that he used to bolster that claim was the resurrection.
Well, that would certainly be a step in the right direction, but I'm glad you seem to be finally making the concession that a resurrection does not automatically make his claims true. It would serve to bolster them, it points to the possibility of those claims being true, but given the fact that even within the Christian religion there are other people who were raised from the dead without being God, it's definitely not a clincher.
He claimed that he was going to die, and then after he died, the Bible writers claimed that he rose from the grave.
Okay, you're using a lot of language here that's making it rather easy to point out why, even if what you say is technically correct, it still doesn't lead to the conclusion that Jesus definitely for sure rose from the dead. So, thanks, I guess?
You know, the fact of the matter is Christianity stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Did Jesus really rise from the grave?
No.
Is there evidence that proves that to be a historical reality?
No, there isn't, because that's not how historical evidence works. When figuring out which historical events are fact and which are fiction, historians have to compare the various accounts of an event in order to figure out which version is the most probable version. And sometimes this involves trusting different parts of conflicting accounts. A good chunk of this can be achieved through source criticism, figuring out who wrote a source, what their cultural context was, what they were trying to communicate, who was their intended audience, what motivations they may have had, etc. But the thing with miracle claims is that no matter how excellent the source may be, they can never be said to be proven simply by virtue of the fact that, by definition, a miraculous event is a low probability event. Even if you could never think of a way that that particular miracle could have been faked, and you have an account of it coming from a source that has never been known to be inaccurate, the idea that such an accurate source was wrong at least once is way more probable than an actual miracle being true. This by itself does not prove that miracles are impossible, but using historical methods, miracles from ancient history can never be proven just by virtue of the fact that they are definitionally low probability events.
Yes.
No, there isn't, and there literally can't be. But prove is a strong word here. It doesn't really leave any room for doubt. So because you're using that word, I'm going to expect some really strong evidence. 6 pieces of strong evidence if the title of your video is anything to go by. And again, going by the title of the video, each one should be enough on its own to prove the resurrection. Now, I know it's often a cumulative case thing, but if I grant that a cumulative case could potentially prove the resurrection, that whole case would count as one proof, so there should be 6 here.
There is. I'm going to give you 6 facts that lead to the inevitable conclusion that Jesus Christ rose from the grave.
And each fact should be able to get us there on its own as well, right?
Fact number 1, Jesus Christ lived.
Well, that's more than a bit mundane, don't you think? A guy named Yeshua lived in a time when guys named Yeshua were a dime a dozen. I have no problem granting this for the sake of getting to more interesting parts of the argument, but make that a supporting detail for one of the facts. It's not a big enough deal to get its own fact.
That seems very simple. It seems like maybe you shouldn't even put that in a list of facts that validate the resurrection.
Right. We know that people existed back then, so to say that a person existed back then is not all that interesting on its own. Given that, rather than address everything he says about the historicity of Jesus, I'm just going to go ahead and skip to fact 2. If you want to watch someone argue against the historicity of Jesus, go to Godless Engineer's channel, because that's not a debate that I'm really all that interested in.
Fact number 2, Jesus Christ died.
Jesus fucking Christ, really? Of fucking course he died, you numpty. Everyone who lived 2,000 years ago died. Actually, I'd be a fair bit more impressed if you could somehow demonstrate that a guy who was born 2,000 years ago did not die.
Once you show that Jesus was a historical person, then coming to the conclusion that Jesus Christ died, even the skeptic has to agree, would be true.
Yeah, obviously. So, thus far, a third of your proofs that an event that is completely unprecedented throughout human history is actually a real event are just, a guy lived 2,000 years ago, and then he died. Do people really find this sort of argumentation to be persuasive? Like, he doesn't even go so far as to say was crucified here like apologists normally do, just that he died. So I'm going to go ahead and skip the rest of this one as well. Hopefully he actually gives me something interesting to respond to at some point, or this might turn out to be a really short video.
Fact number 3, the tomb of Jesus was empty.
Finally, getting into some actual stuff that is worth contesting. I mean, nothing surprising here, but at least it's better than he done died.
So Jesus lived, Jesus died, and he was buried, but that tomb, what happened there?
Well, I mean, you're just starting with the assumption that he was buried in a tomb. How do you know he wasn't discarded in a mass grave as was the normal treatment for crucifixion victims at the time? Because there's really nothing to indicate that a tomb burial was involved until the gospel accounts. Certainly, Paul makes no mention of such an important detail, even when he talks about Jesus having been buried. Usually, the arguments for the tomb burial center around a handful of other crucifixion victims being given to their families. And by handful, I actually mean one account from Philo of Alexandria talking about having heard of rare instances of crucifixion victims being taken down prior to the celebration of the emperor's birthday. This notable exception to the normal crucifixion practice of leaving the bodies up to rot before tossing them in a mass grave is notable precisely because it is an exception. This does leave open the possibility that Jesus was taken down and given to someone for a tomb burial if he was crucified sometime near the emperor's birthday, ignoring for the moment that Emperor Tiberius was born in November and Jesus was crucified around Passover in the springtime. But when examining history, it is a game of probability. What is the most probable course of events? And the most probable course of events for Jesus after his crucifixion was that he was left on the cross and buried in a mass grave afterward.
Is it a fact of history that that tomb was empty?
Even if it were, nobody wrote about the tomb being empty until at least 30 years after the fact. So how would anybody check that? People say it's not possible for the body to have been stolen because of the Roman guard, but think about this from the atheist perspective for a moment. If Jesus was indeed taken down and put in a tomb with a Roman guard, and the biblical stories of Jesus were based on oral stories about him circulating and being subject to exaggeration here and there, with the occasional disciple hallucination adding to the story of Jesus' rise from the grave, would the Romans really have invested the resources needed to keep a constant guard on this one guy's tomb for 3 decades? Nobody would have had any opportunity to steal the body in that amount of time? Would they even have bothered for more than a few weeks at most? Even if you want to go with the stolen body idea, why does the body have to be stolen on the weekend of Jesus' death? Why not a month later when the Romans decided it wasn't worth guarding anymore? Hell, the Romans weren't exactly fond of the Jews in that time period, so if the whisperings of a new faction within Judaism started circulating, and the Jewish leaders were sending people like Saul of Tarsus around trying to eliminate the Christians, who's to say that they wouldn't have made the body disappear in order to further sow dissent among the Jewish people and these new Christians? I mean, really, that is an incredibly unlikely scenario in my mind. Like I said, the most likely scenario is that Jesus just ended up in a mass grave and his body couldn't even be found because it was unrecognizable. But even this incredibly implausible and completely unevidenced scenario of Roman prankster guards is infinitely more likely than an actual resurrection.
The Bible writers say that the tomb was empty.
I mean, obviously, the guys whose whole purpose in writing is to spread a religion about the guy that they think rose from the dead are going to say that the tomb was empty. It's not really much of a rise from the dead if the body's still there.
But that's not the only testimony to the empty tomb.
It's not? Is there an earlier one? One that wouldn't just be repeating the gospel claims that clearly grew from oral retellings coupled with exaggerations?
In fact, there was a Jewish writing going around early after the resurrection of Jesus that was explaining the empty tomb.
Really? Well, this is the first that I've heard of it. I might have to go issue a correction on my Lee Strobel video where I said that there are no extra-biblical accounts that attempt to explain why the tomb was empty.
And that writing said that a godless and lawless heresy had sprung up from Jesus, a Galilean, whom we crucified, this Jewish writing said, but his disciples stole him by night from the tomb where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he's risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. Now, notice what that writing is doing. They're forced to admit the tomb is empty.
Okay, so do you plan on saying where this Jewish account of the empty tomb came from? Because I know where it's from, and I feel like you're not going to say it because it will greatly hurt the point that you're trying to make here. Now, I'll give you guys a hint. It was written between 155 and 160 CE, which I guess Kyle considers to be early after the resurrection. So, right there, the dating is such that the author could not possibly have personally verified the empty tomb, so that kinda hurts. But that's not the part that completely demolishes the point that Kyle is trying to make here.
That's what Peter was doing on the day of Pentecost when he stood in Jerusalem and he talked about the resurrected Christ. And basically he was challenging his listeners to go and look at the empty tomb. And what you will find is the tomb, and it's empty.
Much like most Christian arguments, there's nothing really there. Even if you're right, an actual empty tomb does not actually prove that there was once a body in the tomb, and now that body rose from the dead. It's just an empty tomb. But yeah, in Acts 2, Peter is said to have said that the tomb is with us to this day. No mention of where it is or how to find it, but if we assume that this is an accurate account, which is a rather large assumption, I suppose we could take this as Peter telling the people that they can go check for themselves that the tomb is indeed empty. But that doesn't really matter. Let's circle back to that Jewish account of the empty tomb with the disciples having stolen the body, because after watching ahead a bit, I am 99.9% certain that he is not going to mention where it comes from. I haven't watched all the way to the end yet, but I'm pretty sure it's not coming anytime soon. Well, those words were actually written by Justin Martyr, a 2nd century Christian apologist. But wait, didn't he say it was a Jewish account? Yes, he slips that in because this particular passage comes from a book that Justin Martyr wrote called Dialogue with Trypho, which is about a chance meeting between Justin and a Jewish rabbi named Trypho, who some historians consider to be the Rabbi Tarfon, and others consider to be entirely fictional. So, if he's fictional, then this is just a Christian writing a hypothetical conversation with a hypothetical Jew, not an actual Jewish account of the empty tomb. And if he's not fictional, then this is a Christian report of a conversation with a Jew of the "I had so many answers I totally owned that non-believer" genre, which is common to hear at church pulpits today. So for a good example of that, there's a Prophet of Zod video that I will link in the description and in a card, in which Zod was the atheist in this hypothetical conversation. Do we have reason to think that such hypothetical and exaggerated conversations were not a thing in the early church? No, we don't. So the reason Kyle didn't say what his source was for that was because the source was essentially an evangelist giving a biased account of how awesome he did at evangelizing to that Jewish rabbi that one time. And even if I grant that the conversation happened 100% as described, it's essentially just a rabbi coming up with explanations for arguments that he hasn't heard yet. He is in no way saying that he's seen the empty tomb himself, nor is he repeating the consensus that Jesus' body was stolen. That's just him coming up with a response to a Christian apologist on the spot.
Jesus lived, Jesus died, and the tomb where Jesus was buried was empty.
But in order to reach that conclusion, you had to dishonestly quote a Christian source while calling it a Jewish source in order to make it appear more credible than it actually was. I consider that sort of deception to be an admission that you don't have good evidence, because if you did have good evidence, you wouldn't need to outright lie about your evidence in order to make it look better than it is. You could just present the evidence as is and make your case from there. And yes, this sort of deception is officially the tipping point where I am now willing to move from assuming honest intentions combined with motivated reasoning to saying that this is outright deception. So either Kyle Butt or Kyle's writer, or both, are lying. I mean, I guess they might have heard that from another apologist who was lying and they just didn't bother to find the source, and so they're just extremely lazy or sloppy. But as I've never run across this one before, I'm fairly comfortable using the liar label for World Video Bible School now. This is not their first brush with deception, but it is the most blatant.
Fact number 4. The apostles preached that Jesus rose physically from the dead.
Early Christians preached Christian beliefs. That's really not all that remarkable.
Now, on the day of Pentecost, when Peter was preaching that first recorded gospel sermon in about AD 33, he insisted to that multitude of Jews that God had raised Jesus up from the grave, and God had loosed him from the pangs of death.
Yeah, like I said, early Christians believed Christian beliefs. This is entirely unsurprising, but also, the book of Acts was written probably around the same time as the Gospel of Luke, so approximately 50 years after the fact. It's a compilation of stories that the author was collecting specifically to try and work out the history of the religion from all the contradicting accounts, but with complete credulity as to the supernatural events recorded, such as the events of Pentecost. I don't think using an event that describes a bunch of unsubstantiated miracle claims is a good source for demonstrating the truth of a different unsubstantiated miracle claim. This would be like using Ready Player One as a source that demonstrates the truth of the Iron Giant story, because the author of Ready Player One clearly mentions the Iron Giant, and as a bonus, Ready Player One was only written 12 years after the Iron Giant was filmed, so that's way closer to the original source material than the writings of the author of Acts. Though, I guess to be fair, the Iron Giant is supposed to take place in 1957, so it's 12 years after a movie that was about events happening 42 years earlier, so that's actually a lot closer to the timeline of when the Gospels and Acts were written compared to when the events they were actually depicting took place. So, I guess it works.
Peter stated that Jesus Christ rose.
According to the author of Luke and Acts, writing half a century after Peter supposedly stated that, and with no mention as to what his source for that claim would have been.
And not only that Jesus Christ rose, but that it was a physical resurrection. He stated specifically that his flesh would not see corruption.
I know this seems to be more of an internal theological debate, but for me, I've never heard anyone argue against the resurrection on the grounds that it was only a spiritual resurrection. Sure, there are some Christians that hold to such a view, but they're in the minority. And yet, this is a common track for apologetics. They feel the need to counter the almost non-existent claim that the resurrection wasn't a bodily resurrection for some reason.
Some people have said, well, the apostles didn't believe in a physical resurrection. They might have thought they had seen Jesus' ghost or his spirit or something along those lines, but they didn't really teach that it was physical.
See? I've never heard that claim made. I've only ever heard it responded to. But I suppose this is more to counter the idea that the resurrection was a hallucination, because if you're hallucinating, you won't be able to finger his holes, right? But the problem here is that we have no actual writings from the people who would have been eyewitnesses to these events. The only writing we have from anyone claiming to have witnessed anything himself is Paul, and his description of his experience very much lines up with it potentially being a hallucination. Now, sure, people were teaching of the resurrection of Jesus before Paul came along, but we don't really have any data on the origin of such claims. It is entirely possible that it could have been the result of a single disciple having a post-bereavement hallucination, and the story spreading and growing from there, as stories often do.
Oh, on the contrary, they certainly did teach that it was physical. In fact, that was the cornerstone of the preaching and teaching of the apostles. It was the singular criterion that was used to add a new apostle, that person had to have been with the other apostles and witnessed the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead.
I mean, maybe among the Christian sect that ended up winning the battle of history, but there were many versions of Christianity in the early days that did not have a physical resurrection, and so they probably had no such requirement for considering someone to be an apostle. Really, we'll never know, as a lot of these writings were destroyed by the church that ended up winning that part of history.
Fact number 5. The apostles suffered and died because of their teachings on the resurrection.
according to apocryphal books written hundreds to sometimes even more than 1,000 years after the fact, and whose details regarding events other than the disciples' death are widely held as unreliable by apologists. So I'm going to expect this point to come with an explanation as to why we should trust these texts when they record the death of Jesus' followers, but not when they describe things like Andrew turning away an entire army simply by making the sign of the cross at them.
You can't get around that fact.
Of course not. You can't get around something that doesn't exist. Before you can circumvent a fence, the fence has to actually be there.
The apostles went everywhere preaching the resurrection, and when they did, they ran into opposition on every level. With the Jewish community, with the Roman leadership.
Yeah, sure. When you start a new religion, especially one that gets its start as a different sect of an already existing religion, you're gonna make a few people angry. Though for the Romans, at first they didn't really care about Christians, not until Nero's fire anyway. And even after that, while there were sporadic local incidents of persecution, it was never an empire-wide ordeal until about 300 years later.
And not only was it just opposition, but the apostles suffered, they were tortured, and they died for preaching on the resurrection.
Citation needed. The only one whose death is mentioned in the Bible is James, who was killed by King Herod for unstated reasons, and with no mention of any torture or chance to live if only he recants of his story of Jesus' resurrection.
In fact, all they would have had to do to keep that persecution from occurring was to have said something along the lines of, Jesus didn't really come back from the grave.
Find me one single account that makes mention of such a life-saving proclamation being a possibility for any of the apostles or disciples or whatever you want to call them. I'm kind of assuming he's talking about the original 12 here. It doesn't exist. Not a single account of any of the deaths of any of the 12 makes mention of them being allowed to live if only they'll renounce their faith in Jesus. Such an opportunity is often implied by apologists, but no specific examples are ever given. The more honest apologists will instead opt for pointing out that sometimes Christians were persecuted to the point of death, therefore, being an outspoken Christian had a higher likelihood of being executed in one of these manners than not being an outspoken Christian, therefore they were willing to die. But being willing to engage in behavior that has a significant risk associated with it is not the same as going to your death by way of torture without recanting.
We saw his spirit, or it was his personality that was still with us. But no, they preached a physical resurrection. And they died for preaching that physical resurrection of Christ.
Were they being persecuted because they were teaching a physical rather than spiritual resurrection? Would they have been able to escape persecution if they had said, while being tortured, something along the lines of, okay, he was raised from the dead, but spiritually, not physically? I don't think so.
As one Bible scholar stated, he said, while men may die out of religious deception, they do not willingly go to their deaths knowing they are perpetrating a hoax.
Well, as we learned earlier in this video, when Kyle is afraid to give proper attribution to a quote, there's likely some deception going on. In this case, the only place I could find this quote is in a book co-authored by Kyle and Eric Lyons, where they attribute it to a man by the name of Wayne Jackson. I doubt he means Wayne Jackson the singer or Wayne Jackson the trumpet player, so I had to add the words Bible scholar to my search in order to keep the results relevant. There are a few Wayne Jacksons that came up here. There is R. Wayne Jackson, who is a retired business systems administrator who just decided one day in the 80s that he had a complete understanding of the Bible, and so wrote a book on it, which is still unpublished to this day. Then there's Wayne Jackson, who writes for the Christian Courier and has written a few obscure creationist books who I can't really find any information on outside of that, so likely not a scholar. Or there's the president of the Impact Network and bishop of the Great Faith Detroit Church, Wayne T. Jackson. Again, not a scholar. I think he's probably referring to the Christian Courier Wayne Jackson, as it's easier to get away with calling someone who actually writes books a scholar than either of the other two. But yeah, saying that this quote came from a Bible scholar is a stretch, to say the least.
What he simply meant by that was the apostles saw Jesus' resurrected body. They preached Jesus' resurrection in the flesh, and they died for that preaching. Do you know why?
Because it was true, right? Even if I grant that everything you said thus far is true, the nobody dies for a lie line is just patently false. Yes, I know the distinction between a modern suicide bomber and one of the disciples is supposedly that the disciples were in a position to know that it was a lie, but there's a few things wrong with this line of thinking that actually don't have anything to do with that distinction. First, they could have been sincerely mistaken. A hallucination would do the trick if they thought it was real. Second, people do die for a lie if they consider the lie to be an important one. Governments expect their spies to die for lies in order to protect sensitive information, and on several occasions, the spies have done just that, knowing that the thing they were dying for was a lie. So, if the disciples knew that it was a lie, they may have just considered it an important enough lie to be worth dying for. That is not without precedent. And then, of course, it all comes back to whether or not they had a chance to not die for it. If they were spreading it as a lie, knowing it to be false, they may have been engaged in this somewhat dangerous activity, knowing that there was a risk of being captured and executed, but planning on evading that fate, and ultimately failing. No criminal engages in their criminal activity under the assumption that they are going to get caught. My point is, all of these scenarios are infinitely more likely than an actual resurrection, and none of them are even necessary to explain the data.
In fact, number 6, the resurrection is recorded in the Bible, and the Bible is the most historically accurate book in history.
Come on, Kyle. That's really your last fact? The Bible isn't even historically accurate when compared to other accounts from the Bible. But sure, it's the most historically accurate book ever written. Give me a break.
While some people don't want to recognize this fact, it is, make no mistake, a fact.
No, it most certainly is not. Do you care to offer any supporting evidence for that claim, or do you just start with that assumption based on your religious beliefs? Like, the Bible records a massive, empire-wide Roman census that never happened. It records King Herod committing baby genocide, which wasn't even recorded by other historical sources that wanted to paint Herod in as bad a light as possible. It records Israel and Judah being a united kingdom in a time when they most definitely were not. It records people like Abraham riding around on camels in a time before camels were domesticated. There is zero evidence for a mass exodus of slaves from Egypt. There's also zero evidence that Egypt even had the entire Hebrew race as slaves in the first place. And I could go on.
Biblical scholar Wayne Jackson noted.
Oh, there's Wayne Jackson again. Curious that you would mention him this time, but not last time, when you do attribute the previous quote to him in your book. Is this source padding, making it look like you have more sources for your information than you actually do?
In the book of Acts, Luke mentions 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 Mediterranean islands.
Oh, fuck me. Let's skip this. Who fucking cares? Ancient writers got some place names and people names correct sometimes. Therefore, it is more historically accurate than books that not only got place and people names correct, but also events. That's a garbage argument, so let's skip to some actual event details.
So, based on the historical grounds, the resurrection of Jesus Christ has as much or more evidence to validate its credibility than any other event in human history.
Nope, not even close. Not even if we restrict our search of historical events to the ancient world. Not even if we restrict our search of historical events to the Bible. It is a claim that is made without any supplementary evidence. The case is so weak that it has people like Kyle here pretending that Christian writers writing books a century after the fact count as hostile Jewish sources for some of the events surrounding the resurrection. Events that, even if those ones could be corroborated, do not actually do anything to prove the resurrection itself.
The primary argument against the resurrection, by those who don't believe it, is that during the normal course of events, dead people don't rise from the grave.
No, that isn't the main argument against it. The point of bringing that up is as a comparison to how we figure out which historical events actually happened in, real history studies, as opposed to those that are embellished or just straight up fabrications. Because when deciding which events are historical, it is entirely a matter of figuring out the most likely course of events given the information that we have. And because a miracle is definitionally improbable, Any naturalistic explanation, no matter how implausible, is more probable than a miracle, pretty much by default. Now, this does not prove that Jesus did not rise from the dead, but it does serve to demonstrate that an actual resurrection is not the most likely course of events. So if you want to convince someone with this argument, you need to bring a lot more data to the table than just the biblical accounts, and then later accounts of people who point out that Christians are a thing that exists. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Tom Payne, who says, "I love the empty tomb. It's an admission that, look, there's nothing there, is one of the best pieces of evidence. I couldn't agree more. There's nothing there, and nothing is good evidence for Christianity." Yup. If the best line of evidence for your religion is, look at what's not in this hole that we can't verify ever even had anything in it, then your religion doesn't have much evidence for it. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, Lynn Dobbs, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the ancient Jewish source that demonstrates the truth of my channel. If you'd like to be a Christian fanfic, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/VicedRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time! I don't think using an event that describes a bunch of unsubstantiated miracle claims is a gorse. I don't know what a gorse is, but that ain't it.